Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. So today we are unpacking a really fascinating analysis of Jean-Paul Sartre. Now, he was easily one of the 20th century's most brilliant minds. A guy who famously theorized about absolute freedom from the comfort of Parisian cafes. But our source material today goes way beyond typical politics. It offers a really rigorous critique of his philosophy, his actions, and ultimately what it calls his flight from reality. Let's just dive right into this intersection of psychology, ideology, and the human soul.
But right off the bat, we have to start with this central historical paradox. Sartre championed personal responsibility, constantly urging humanity to own its choices. Yet when the harsh realities of communism began to surface, the repression, the violence, the camps, Sartre essentially turned a blind eye. So how could a man whose entire philosophy rested on not fleeing responsibility fail to look directly at the destruction carried out in the name of revolution?
Okay, let's look at Section 1, the contradiction of Sartre.
So, the issue the source brings up here wasn't just some simple intellectual mistake. It was a massive, profound split between what he actually preached and what he did. Sartre insisted over and over that human beings must never flee moral responsibility. But when he was confronted with the real-world crimes of the ideology he supported, he essentially replaced reality with a narrative. Instead of asking the fundamental moral question, like, is this just, he simply asked, does this serve the revolution? Objective reality was basically swapped out for an ideological story.
Moving right along to Section 2, the concept of bad faith.
Now, this is where we hit the absolute deepest layer of irony. The analysis actually takes Sartre's own brilliant philosophical concept and uses it against him. Sartre literally coined the term bad faith, or mal fait, as the act of lying to yourself to avoid facing personal freedom, guilt, and responsibility. It's when you choose to blame society or circumstances rather than, actually looking inward. He hit the nail on the head regarding human nature here. But the tragic irony? The text argues that Sartre actually lived in the very bad faith he diagnosed in everyone else.
Next up is Section 3, the envy of God.
So, you've probably heard his most famous axiom, right? Existence precedes essence. On a philosophical level, it basically means man exists first and then defines himself later. But if you peel back the layers, the source argues a much deeper spiritual temptation emerges. This isn't just some abstract theory. It represents a sort of rebellion where humanity refuses its own limits. It's this attempt to invent ourselves entirely, effectively trying to become the absolute judge of good and evil, basically refusing to receive truth and instead wanting to manufacture it from scratch.
Which brings us to Section 4, the religion of ideology.
Our source points out something really interesting here. When philosophy tries to totally wipe out any pre-existing moral order, something else inevitably swoops in to fill that void. Why? Because human beings just can't live without a center. For a lot of modern intellectuals, ideology simply became the new religion. And look at how perfectly these concepts translate. God is replaced by ideology. The desire for redemption becomes this drive for revolution. The church is replaced by the political party. The saint becomes the militant, and the prophet becomes the intellectual. Even the promise of paradise is swapped for this utopian historical future. The argument here is that extreme intelligence, when it's totally separated from reality, organizes into this monstrous system.
All right, let's get into Section 5, the psychological escape.
To really understand why such a brilliant mind would embrace a system like that, we have to look inward at our emotional states. Our philosophies aren't just born in a vacuum, right? According to the text, it starts with deformed affections, things like pride, envy, or resentment. Basically, the person affectively decides they just do not want to obey reality. Then reason kicks in, but only to create intellectual justifications for that emotional refusal. And finally comes the outward projection, blaming external structures like society, class, or your family. The intellect works tirelessly, but literally only in service of avoiding moral responsibility. Now, it's absolutely crucial to maintain some nuance here. The text makes it very clear that real human suffering exists, social injustices are real, traumas are real, family wounds are deeply, deeply real. However, the analysis forcefully rejects the idea that these wounds offer some sort of total absolution. Even if we're conditioned by hardship, man is never entirely determined. We still remain responsible for what we do with our wounds, and we are continually called to the good. Using your own suffering as a shield to avoid that inner struggle against evil, well, the text frames that as the ultimate act of bad faith.
This leads us to Section 6, the surrender to reality.
If ideology and bad faith are the root problems, then the source argues we've got to fundamentally rethink the whole purpose of intelligence. There's this great assertion here. The true philosopher does not create a brilliant system to defeat reality, but lets themselves be conquered by it. I love that phrasing. Reality isn't some obstacle you overcome with a clever narrative. It's a call that demands conversion. Stepping out of falsehood actually requires accepting our human limits and kneeling before objective truth, rather than, creating idols out of our own ideologies.
And that brings us to what the text calls the ultimate tragedy of modern thought. Sartre wanted a free man from God, sure, but the argument is that in doing so, he basically just handed man over to his own lies. The conclusion the source draws is pretty stark. When man tries to be God, he doesn't actually achieve freedom. Instead, he just becomes a slave to his own deformation.
So we'll leave you with this final, really provocative thought from today's explainer. The historical tragedy of Sartre isn't just some abstract lesson from the past, it's kind of a mirror for all of us. When you're looking at your own relationship with the truth, you have a choice. Will you let reality conquer you, or will you remain a slave to your own narrative? Thank you so much for joining me to explore these profound concepts today. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you next time.